So I'd like to welcome Dr. Diarmuid Ó Briain from SETU to give us a presentation on deciphering the EU's cybersecurity framework for industrial and critical infrastructure. Over to you, Diarmuid.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. So I'm going to talk about what the European Union is doing about cybersecurity and the problems that a union of 27 member states with varying networks and varying different organizations that are doing development, whether that be in individual countries or whether it's across countries, critical infrastructure. And we've seen the issue with the electrical grid in Portugal, Spain and France during the a few months ago. So the European Union has to respond to cybersecurity, not for any individual member state, but to protect, if you like, the whole market, to protect the European Union itself. So it has come out with a number of rules, if you like, regulations, directives that are aimed at trying to protect the market. So why is it doing it at the moment? Well, the first thing, it has realized that the voluntary model no longer works. So we've had a decade of best practice documents, guideline documents, and they've all failed to prevent any kind of systematic outages and the breaches we've had. And no less in Ireland, we've seen that with the attack on the HSE, and it's referred to all the time, but it was a major attack. We've also seen attack on utility grids, particularly in Eastern Europe, and that's been happening since the invasion of Crimea and even before the invasion of Crimea, in 2014. So all of that is feeding into why we have to have this response from the European Union. The digital sovereignty pivot is the idea that as geopolitical world has changed, geopolitics has changed, we've seen America become less than stable as a partner for Europe. So we're seeing Europe looking at its dependency on the likes of Microsoft products, Google, and all of these social media outlets, Facebook and Meta and all of these, and seeing the problem with that. And Europe wants the ability to be able to act independently and be not reliant on other partners outside of our allies, if you like. And America was seen as that ally for so long, part of NATO, seen as, similar kind of culture to ours in Europe. And now we're seeing that breaking down. And that trust is broken down to a point where Europe now sees it must pivot away from everybody like that and develop its own independence in that regard. So systematic independence then is the idea the world is super connected. So the internet has brought us closer and closer together, and as it's evolved, it's just got, much more connected. So now we could have a single industrial sensor, a local water pump is now a threat because that could have a knock-on impact on some sort of critical infrastructure. And multiple regulations. So Europe has broken this down into a number of parts. I'm going to go through the 5 major parts that I consider the bastions of cybersecurity for industrial networks and critical infrastructure, but they're not just these 5. There are others as well, and they're all part of a synchronized package of solutions, if you like, to create an overall cybersecurity solution that will close all the gaps from the factory floor right up to the boardroom. So we're going to start out with the foundational one. We look at that one, which is NIS2, Network Information System version 2. And this is probably the oldest one as well. It started as NIST back in 2016. And it's foundational in that it was the first one that they tried to implement a law, if you like, for the European Union and see how would that impact outside the European Union. So I think Europe realized with the NIST 1 and now NIST 2 that actually if it develops a law for the Union, because so many other countries are dependent on selling their products inside the Union, and realize that to be compliant with, or to be able to sell those products and to be able to sell those services, they must be compliant with NIST 2, because that's a basic requirement to protect European citizens. Okay, so it's basically setting out the what and who. So it's about the operators of, what the operators must do to protect their systems. The next one then is the critical entities resilience. So critical entity resilience is our physical anchor, if you like. So it's mandating physical protections of a site, and it's aligning those physical protections with digital security. So it's another very important pillar, if you like, in this overall protection. And then we have the Cyber Resilience Act. And that looks at technical standards. And it says if you want to sell products into the European Union, then you must meet with these minimal standards. So it's setting down the minimum standards that any organization that wants to sell a product within the European Union must meet, whether they be a European organization, a Chinese organization, an American one, or from Western Samoa for that matter. It doesn't matter where they're from, they must comply with these standards. On top of that, then we have the AI Act. As we all know, the AI is just, really, I suppose, hit our lives in a big way over the last 2 years or so. So the European Union said, in a similar vein to NIS2, we need to establish a risk-based framework that protects our citizens from misuse of AI. Okay, so it's ensuring that systems are safe, transparent, and respect fundamental rights of European citizens. And again, the idea is not that this would just be for the European Union. It is, but in effect, because it's implemented for the European Union, other countries pick it up or realize that, well, if we want to get our products working in Europe, then we must meet this standard. And generally, when they do that on a large scale, then they may as well meet the same standard for other countries as well. So it becomes almost a global standard. And the final one then is an updated one. There was a Cybersecurity Act, but the Cybersecurity Act 2, now, not to be confused with the Cybersecurity bill that's going through the Irish Dáil at the moment, which is really to transpose NIS2 into Irish law. This Cybersecurity Act is a European directive, if you like, and that sets out a framework of certification. Because what they realized as well is now that we have all of these various directives and regulations, there's reporting requirements from all of these, and a lot of organizations end up having multiple reporting lines for different directives and regulations, and it just means that they're getting kind of, if you like, tired from all of the different verifications that are coming in. So this is putting a framework around a single reporting mechanism for a lot of these various standards that they have. So sort of before I go on into the rest of the presentation, I just wanted to quickly talk about the difference between IT and OT for those of you who might know. So IT, information technology, I'm quite sure you're all familiar with that since the 1970s. That's basically data and the flow of digital information between computers. Whereas OT, or operational technology, it's actually quite a relatively new term. It came around through a standard called NIST Special Publication 882, and the version 3 of it. And basically it talks about any kind of IT that has a link to a physical process. So if you take a factory where there's a manufacturing line, that manufacturing line is being ran by computers. Those computers are actually part of OT rather than IT because they have access to a physical process. The idea being, if you were to hack into that computer, you could impact the physical process and therefore either create a lot of damage or even risk human safety. This Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture is an architecture that goes back actually to the 1990s. And the idea here is that in the past, if you look at the manufacturing zone and safety zone, the bottom two major layers there in that diagram, they were seen to be the factory. And there would have been a complete isolation, or what we call an air gap, between that factory and the enterprise zone, which is where the IT software and the IT hardware would reside. As time has moved on, that kind of pink area that I'm showing, a pink red area with demilitarized zone, that was originally an air gap. There was no connection between the enterprise zone and the manufacturing zone. However, as time has gone on, we're seeing more coupling between manufacturing zone, for example, counting widgets that it's after producing on a floor, or looking at the water levels in a reservoir for electrical generation or something like that. That information needs to be fed up to software that's sitting in the enterprise zone. So therefore, we now have traffic that's going between the enterprise zone and the manufacturing zone. And that becomes a real risk. So that's where the hackers attack into the enterprise zone and get across the demilitarized zone into the manufacturing zone. And now they're able to do damage in a way they could not have done when there was an air gap. So just so I'm going to go through some terms then, you're going to hear these, and some of these are quite interchangeable really. So we start at the bottom there, we've the distributed control system, which is basically, if you like, a management system that's single site in orientation. It's process driven in that the management software is in a continuous loop with a process. And if something happens to process, the DCS can respond immediately to that particular process. Okay, it's it's a very good system. It's an excellent system in that if there's something goes wrong with the process, almost immediately there can be a response. SCADA then is basically our supervisory control and data acquisition, is also a management system, but it tends to be used on larger networks where there are multiple sites. It's event driven. So an example would be the electricity network would have a SCADA system up in Leopardstown that the ESB run, and should a tree fall on a wire in West Cork, that's an event. That event is flagged to the SCADA system, and then the SCADA system is able to respond to it. In this case, though, SCADA is waiting for a change. It's actually waiting for an event to happen. That's why it's event-driven rather than process-driven. But they're very, very similar in general picture of what they're doing, but they just do it in a different way. The red box then is industrial control systems, and that would be a term that's around quite a long time. It would have come from that SP 882 Revision 1 document, which was a guide to cybersecurity for industrial control systems. Then the ISA, the International Society of Automation, came out with their 62443 standard, and they used the term IACS, which they added in automation, so industrial automation and control systems. So really, ICS, IACS, they're the same thing. It just depends on whether you're talking about the NIST standard or the ISA standard. The ISA have been talking about removing the I now because they see that actually it's not always industrial, and we have to think about systems that are physical, but not quite industrial. And then in the revision 3 of the special publication 882, they renamed it from ICS to Cybersecurity for Operational Technology. So to be honest, if you look at ICS, IACS, ACS, OT, they all really mean the same thing. I suppose they're just widening the scope as you go from the center outwards. But in general, you can consider them the same. So if someone's talking about OT, they're really talking about IACS or ICS. So this is quite an important slide. This talks about the core priorities between IT and OT. So IT's priority is always the CIA triad, or the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we always prioritize confidentiality when we're talking about data, then the integrity of the data, and then the data's availability. So for example, if our printer is down for a few minutes, doesn't really matter. The printer comes back up, you get to print again. If some server is down for a couple of milliseconds, doesn't matter that much. You won't notice because your application will just maybe run slightly slower. You mightn't even notice, but it's not as big a priority as confidentiality. We don't want the data stolen or the data compromised. In the OT world, because our IT that we use in the OT world is actually linked to physical processes, our overriding thing is safety, human safety. Imagine a manufacturing line with cobots or robots, and the robot arm is taken over and it swings around and hits an operator, kills them or physically hurts them. That's the first priority, that can't happen. The next thing is availability. If you think about a manufacturing site or think about a water reservoir, for example, we can't have a couple of milliseconds of timeout because that might be the difference between a signal being sent from the SCADA system to a PLC that's operating the sluice gate that's holding the water inside the dam. And if that didn't happen in a particular time, it could have another knock-on effect. It could have a catastrophic effect, in fact, in a manufacturing site. So availability is always the number one priority after human safety. Then integrity of data, and then confidentiality. So if you like, the priorities for IT are reversed with human safety added as well. So the first one of these European standards I'm going to look at is the NIST 2. Okay, Network Information Security version 2. Okay, so NIST 2 is basically a new version of what was the original Network Information Security standard. The original standard was all around carriers, operators that were operating, telecommunication systems. So if you had broadband systems coming from Virgin Media or from Aircom, or you had telephone systems, those systems were protected under the original NIST because they wanted to make sure that the internet was remaining stable and networks in effect were remaining stable within the Union. However, it was fairly quickly realized, that came in 2016. It was fairly quickly realized that actually there's a problem here. there's more that is critical than just the telecommunications networks. We have to look at the carriers. We have to look at, for sure, but we also have to look at, marine shipping. We have to look at, other types of transport, rail. We have to look at food production. There's so many other areas that needed to be looked at. So when NIS2 came along, they decided that they needed to break it into a number of parts. There was parts that are responsibility of the member state, and there are parts that are responsibility of the Central European side of things. I like to look at these as the carrot and the stick. So on the left-hand side, you have really the stick. This is the member state who is trying to make sure that all of its operators and its companies are compliant. On the other hand, the European Union is saying, well, we have to give them tools and give them something as well. So we have like the cooperation groups, the cybersecurity incident response team network. So if you have an incident response team, you can link into this European network and get information from them. We have the European Cyber Crisis Liaison Organization, Cyclone. We have the Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure Databases from the European Union, peer reviews, and INESA there is the European organization for covering all of cybersecurity for the European Union. And that organization puts out a biannual report that is giving information about what's been going on over the last 6 months within the Union. Each company then is responsible for risk management. And they've specified that accountability comes from the top down. So accountability is a real key part of this. It breaks organizations up into essential and important entities. I'll talk about that in a moment. And companies are legally required to notify the center, if you like, of any problems that happen. And I'll explain how that happens. So looking at Ireland, we have broken up into what's called competent authorities. Now, this actually isn't enacted yet because the cybersecurity bill is still passing through the Dáil. And 3 weeks ago, the minister said in the Dáil, my department is currently working with the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, the OPC, and the Attorney General's Office on the drafting of the bill, which is at a very advanced stage. This bill is a priority for myself and the government, and I expect to be in a position to bring it to Cabinet shortly, seeking approval to have it published. Now, in reality, that bill should have been published on the 18th of October 2024. To be fair, Ireland isn't the only one that's late on this. There's only 9 countries have actually transposed NIS2 into their laws yet. But we're actually quite advanced in what we have already put in place with the National Cybersecurity Centre and what the National Cybersecurity Centre have done in terms of NIS1 and are prepared for NIS2. The big step in this from NIS1 to NIS2 is all responsibility was with the National Cybersecurity Centre under NIS1. Under NIS2, that is devolved out to competent authorities. So the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities, the Irish Aviation Authority, Comreg, etc., 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 have all been given their domains to be responsible for. Then they report into the SPOC, which is basically the special point of contact. And that special point of contact, being the NCSC, has within it a CSIRT, a Cybersecurity Incident Response Team, and that is responsible to INESA, the European team. So that's the flow of information, if you like, goes from the competent authorities through the SPOC to INESA. So then, basically all entities are broken down into either being involved in this or not. So it has a level small and micro enterprises, which are not really in scope here at all. But they are in for a small number of areas, and I'll explain those in a second. And they define those as less than 50 employees or less than 10 million in revenue. A medium enterprise then 50 to 250 employees basically and 50 million in revenue. And a large enterprise which goes from 50 million in revenue and 250 employees. However, while that's the 3 groups that exist at the moment, they are talking about adding in a 4th group. And the idea being that the large enterprise was starting at too low a base, so there were too many smaller organizations getting caught up, or medium-sized organizations, let's say, that were getting caught up in the large enterprise group. So there's a proposal at the moment to add in a new group, a small mid-cap group, and you can see that there, that it pushes the large enterprise out to 150 million in revenue and 750 employees, with the mid-cap group sitting in the middle. So then NIS2, it actually defines these sectors of high criticality. So you can see what they are: energy, transport, banking, financial markets, drinking water, wastewater, health and space, and they're all added onto digital infrastructure. Digital infrastructure was what the original NIST was involved in supporting. And digital infrastructure is such a large area that they have a special implementation regulation that goes along with NIS2, which I've defined there on the screen, 2024-2690. Okay, so depending on the size of the organization, so you can see my symbols there. So if you look at this, the large enterprise and the medium enterprise, so all large enterprises become essential entities, and important entities then are, medium size organizations. There's no small to medium involved in these. However, digital infrastructure has a couple of special ones. So the special ones are qualified trust service providers, DNS service providers, top-level domain registries, and providers of public electronic networks. So in this case, so say for example, you have a company like with 10 employees that are providing DNS services that are critical, say the .ie domain, or that's probably a bad example, but some number of domains that are being supported by a DNS provider, such that if they were to go down, that would bring those services down. So in that case, all providers, whether they're small, medium or large, are considered essential entities. In the case of public networks, so that would be carriers, if we take the Aircoms, Viatel, Virgin Media, they would all be considered essential entities. Important entities would be, say, for example, the WISPs, wireless internet service providers, Munster Broadband or Aptus Broadband. Those kind of organizations would be then considered important entities. Though they might be quite small, they might only have 8 to 10 employees, but they could actually get caught under the NIS2 regulations. In terms of government, it has broken it down as central government and regional government. All central government is an essential entity, and all regional government, in other words, councils and the NUTS 2 organisations like the Ireland Southern and Ireland Northern, etc., they are important entities. And then they have NIS2 other critical sectors. So these are sectors that are considered important entities no matter the size. So there's no essential entities in terms of postal and courier, for example. They're important entities. Waste management, chemicals, food, manufacturing. Digital providers in this case would be like social media organizations and then research organizations. So what's the difference between an essential entity and an important entity in terms of how the directive is actually implemented? Well, essential entities are what's considered ex ante or ex post supervision. That means that the competent authority or the National Cybersecurity Centre can actually look at them either in advance, or they can look at them after an event has happened. So if you're big enough, basically the National Cybersecurity Centre or the competent authorities will actually supervise the organisation whether they've had an incident or not. So they can go in advance and say, show me that you are meeting the requirements of NIS2. In terms of important entities, there's just too many to do ex ante supervision. So they're all ex post supervision. So should an event happen, then there would be actually supervision on them to show that they actually met the requirements or not. And obviously the penalties would apply then if they didn't. There's a reporting table there then as well to show what's required in terms of reporting. So if you have any event, if you're one of these organizations, you are required to give early warning to your competent authority. Actually, you do it through the CCERT for the National Cybersecurity Centre. They take in all the reports, so there's a single reporting system. So you report in that you have had an attack or you have had some sort of an event. So you'll also give whatever your first presumptions are in terms of that, so they have some idea what's going on. After 72 hours, then, a full notification report has to be communicated, and that contains an assessment of the incident, severity and impact, and any indicators of compromise that you might have. They can, on request, they can demand a report. So they can look for a report and you have to obviously respond to those requests. After 1 month, they're expected to give a final report. Now, that might be quite unrealistic. I've seen, particularly in the OT world, where an incident happens and it could be 12 months before the whole thing is recovered. I know there was an incident in this university in SETU and the incident is still not properly resolved. So a final report may not actually be a final report, if you know what I mean. Every 3 months, the CSERT, in our case, the NCSC, will round up all of the reports that they've got and they will create a full report that they pass on to ANESA. And then biannually, ANESA will actually give our report EU-wide. You can go to the website and download it. And it's full of lots of good information if you want to find out what's going on over the last 6 months in terms of cyber attacks in the Union. Okay, so responsibility is really pushed onto, and accountability onto the senior management within an organization. And what is expected under NIS2 is that you meet all of these risk management measures. So they're listed there on the left-hand side, and I'll talk about the way Ireland is dealing with this in a moment. But all of the different various levels of security that you have to consider as part of NIS2. Okay? And all the measures that you put in place obviously have to be proportionate. If you're a small wireless internet service provider in West Cork, you're not expected to be putting in the same level of security. You obviously have to think about your security and try to do as best you can, but it's realized that you don't have the financial clout or to do something like Air could do, for example, because they've got a bigger network and they've got more money and they can do more. But you do have to take account of the state of the art and current standards. So it's expected that you will put in place the current standards. Now, it doesn't actually say it, but for operational technology, it kind of pushes you towards looking at the ISA, the International Society of Automation 62443 standard, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. To ensure that companies are compliant, again, depending on whether you're ex ante or ex post, the EU can carry out risk assessments, they can impose various certification obligations on you, and they can adopt what's called implementing acts. Okay, so they can actually force you to carry out some act that they feel is necessary to remediate whatever the problem is. And the penalties are quite strict. So two particular articles within this too. Article 21, which is the risk management measures that I had in the previous slide, and Article 23, reporting obligations. So it's important that you comply with those reporting obligations. And I mentioned the timelines there in the earlier slide. The fines that you can receive is up to 10 million or 2% of annual turnover worldwide in the previous year, whichever one of those is the larger. So if you're a large organization, it can be a very, very, it can be almost not quite limitless, but it can be a very, very, very high penalty, well beyond 10 million. 10 million is the bottom end of the scale. And if you're an important entity, 7 million or 1.4% of annual turnover worldwide, which is whichever one is the largest. So if you're that wireless internet service provider in West Cork, you potentially could be seeing a fine of 7 million euros, which would put you out of business. So that's why the fines are very, very large on purpose, to make sure that organizations take this seriously. Okay, so management of essential and important entities, then, they're putting a lot of responsibility on them. They have to approve all cybersecurity risk management measures. How is the organization dealing with the various risk management measures? They must approve them. They must oversee the implementation of the measures. So it's not enough to appoint a CISO or a CTO or a CIO and say, look, you take over all that cybersecurity. The CEO and the CEO's team is responsible for this. They are legally required to undergo cybersecurity training to understand what how to assess risks and the impact it could have on their organization and how they're going to go about approving and overseeing. They're going to have to make sure that they provide regular cybersecurity training for their employees as well. And again, all of this stuff would be considered if there was an incident and there was an ex ante or an ex post investigation done as to why something happened. If you put the stuff in place, well then, okay, it happened and you'll get help. But if you didn't, then you're in for some fines probably. And they have to be accountable for non-compliance. So that's kind of a big one. So they are personally responsible, not just You can't just say, well, the company failed and therefore the company gets penalized. The individual board members become personally responsible. That's a big one. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the ISO 27001 information security management, the building of standard for establishing, implementing, and improving your information security management system. Okay, so it facilitates some compliance with NIS2, but not all, particularly depending on what the organization is. Okay, it's a structured framework for risk management. There are 93 controls that are, very strong in terms of IT, not so strong in terms of OT. It promotes leadership engagement and accountability, which is really good. That's part of NIS2. So that aligns with NIS2. And senior management have to have oversight, and they have to sponsor, if you like, an ISO 27001 implementation of an information security management system. It enhances trust and reliability across the supply chain, because if you show that you're ISO 27001 compliant and you've passed all that certification, other organizations will see you as a trustable organization, that you're putting into place best practice, and you're also, your cyber hygiene is good. I'm going through these frameworks very, very quickly because there's a lot of them. We have courses on these different frameworks, so there's a lot within them. So ISA, or the International Society of Automation, and the IEC, the International Electrical Commission, they have the 62443 standard. It's really the ISA standard that the IEC also sell, I suppose. And this is security for industrial automation and control systems. In fact, it's this standard that brought that IACS term into place. So it's a comprehensive security framework specific for IACS or OT. I said before, we can use those interchangeably. It addresses the unique characteristics of OT, such as real-time performance, safety, legacy systems. It enables organizations to systematically manage cybersecurity risk and build security programs around that risk. It directly aligns with the NIS2 for risk analysis, security policies, incident handling, and supply chain security. And it ensures NIS2 compliance and significantly enhances all operational resilience against cyber threats. It's a really, really strong framework if you're a manufacturing organization or you're a utility provider and you have a lot of OT equipment. It's a very, very, very strong one. It's very, very tough to actually achieve it as well. It's quite an achievement to get it in place. So organizations like the ESB certainly would be working towards the 62443 standard, and if they get it, definitely it meets most of the requirements for NIS2. So the Irish government, through the National Cybersecurity Centre, is going through the process of bringing the National Cybersecurity Bill into law over this year. It should have happened before now, but it is being worked on as we speak, so to speak. And he said it's at an advanced stage, and it really needs to be. So part of that, though, the National Cybersecurity Centre is already preparing for it and has already created these competent authorities, and internally it has already given people responsibilities within this too, despite the fact it hasn't been quite transposed yet. The transposition, as well as actually bringing the NIS2 into law, will also enhance a lot of the functions of the National Cybersecurity Centre as well. It gives them extra authority and it gives them extra resources, if you like, for dealing with this particular directive. And the first thing they have done is they've come out with these risk management measures, which is the minimum baseline requirements for essential and important entities. And it is also worked with the Belgians. The Belgians have a tool called Cyber Fundamentals, or CyFund 2023. And together they've worked on a new one, which was released recently, Cyber Fundamentals 2025. And that tool is a way that you can actually demonstrate how you are meeting the risk management measures. So if you like, the risk management measures is what you must do. How you do it, they don't really mind as long as you do it. But to try to help organizations, they provide this CyFund tool to show how you can prove you've done it. Okay, so it's a really nice tool, and I'll talk about that in a second. So there are 16 different risk management measures, and you can see them all there. Each one of those has a document. There's a document with sections in each one of those outlining exactly what you have to do if you're an important entity or an essential entity. And it breaks things down into two types of actions. Foundational actions, things you must do, supporting actions, things you should do. And these are you know, if you like, the baseline things that the organization must do. So if you like, they're telling you, you must do this stuff. On top of that, along with the Belgians, the Maltese, and the Belgians, Maltese, and there's another, Romanians have implemented CyFund 2025. I know the French are looking at it, and it looks like eventually it'll probably become an EU standard, because what they've done is they've taken a number of different standards. They've taken NIST, which is the American National, the National Science and Technology Institute. Their cybersecurity they have a cybersecurity framework 2.0, and that framework, they've taken it and they've used that as the basis for this. Now, the European Union and ESA does not recommend CSF 2.0 as a tool in itself for showing compliance with NIST 2. It's basically a guideline that the US government have come up with that it uses for organizations in the US, but it's a guideline. It's not actually a framework that's assessed, but it is used as the basis for cyber fundamentals. It's taken some of the controls and guidance from ISO 27001, particularly around the IT side, and it is likewise taking controls from the ISA IEC 62443 standard, which is on the OT side. And some controls also come from another framework called the CIS controls. This is the Center for Internet Security, and there's some controls there. So taking controls from 27001, 62443, and the CIS controls, putting them together into a structured set of controls that meet all of the risk management measures of NIST 2, and sitting that on top of a framework, the Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, it's created a brand new framework. So if we compare them, we can see that the NIST CSF doesn't really meet the requirements. There's a lot of amber there. So there's indirect meeting some of the NIST 2 risk management measure requirements. Okay, whereas if we look at 27001, it meets most of them. It doesn't have incident handling timelines, and it doesn't meet some areas around the OT side. 62443, it's really focused on the OT side and doesn't necessarily meet all of the things on the IT side. Whereas Cyber Fundamentals 2025 was specifically designed to meet all of the requirements. So if you were going along and implementing, even if you have 27001 and 62443 implemented in your organization, it's still well worth using the Cyber Fundamentals framework as a way of testing. Have I met all of these? Because there's a self-assessment tool within it. So you can self-assess against all of these controls. And then that self-assessment will give you a score, and you can see whether you are meeting the requirements of NIST 2 or not. And it also can be used by smaller organizations or medium-sized organizations to demonstrate to a conformity assessment board or an organization that basically verifies organizations are meeting the requirements of NIST 2. So you can get a certificate to say the organization meets the requirements of NIST 2. So there's no reason why you couldn't use 27001, 62443 and Cyber Fundamentals as part of your package. So that's NIST 2. So I'll move on to the next one then, critical entity resilience. So this particular directive then has replaced an existing one that was their European Critical Infrastructure Directive. And it widens the scope again, very like NIST 2 widened the scope from NIST 1. It saw weaknesses in the original directive and widened out to make it more comprehensive. So it's an all hazards approach to resilience. And it covers everything from natural disasters to cyber physical espionage and cyber physical sabotage. And it's a requirement that companies be designated by ESA, and they will designate the type of companies, very, very like what was done for essential and important entities. There will be some framework about what companies will get caught up in this. And that must be done by the 17th of July of this year. So in a few months' time. A bit like NIST 2, it has basically broken the whole sector down into these areas. So you can see they're very similar to the critical sectors within NIS2. So we have energy, transport, banking, finance, health, drinking water, wastewater. Some of, drinking water, wastewater, and health have come up from the other sectors into critical sectors. In this particular one, digital infrastructure, again, public administration, they've added space and food. So they all are now what are considered under the critical entities resilience. In a similar way, again, to NIS2, we have the same sort of structure with the critical entities. And if you are an entity that was classified here underneath the CER, you automatically are also classified as an essential entity under NIS2. So for example, if your entity is classified under wastewater, despite the fact that wastewater doesn't come in as a sector in the critical side of NIS2, you become an essential entity under NIS2 also. So, you can see the chain of link between NIS2 and the critical entities resilience. And in Ireland's case, we've implemented a special an SI 55/9/2024 regulation that actually implements this. So this has already been implemented in Ireland. It's a statutory instrument that's been implemented. Reporting obligations, should you be an incident under CER? So, you've seen that a lot now in Ireland, apart from cyber, with the flooding and with, weather events. So they exist, but obviously also with the cyber side of things. So we have to notify within 24 hours. So here's another notification. And this is what we're going to talk about in a few minutes with the Cybersecurity Act 2, where we talk about the digital omnibus, so the way that you can actually report all sorts of things into a kind of a common path. Okay, so initial notification is a heads up, so you're not expected to give all of the details. It doesn't require your forensic analysis. It must be timely to allow the CAs to provide support and to coordinate any cross-border activities within the Union. So in this case, cross-border means with France and not with Northern Ireland, though obviously we have that special case with Northern Ireland where we would have a separate relationship with them in this kind of an area. The significance test then is we have to make sure that the reports are valid. So we're not being disruptive by putting in reports that, don't have the potential that, to cause problems. So we must have a significant disruptive effect or the potential for a significant disruptive effect to actually report. And then coordinated reporting, as I said, the digital omnibus, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, is how reports are done, not just for the NIS2 and not just for the critical entities resilience, but also for the AI Act and for other areas as well, to try to reduce kind of reporting fatigue. You're not trying to report into various different channels really about the same thing. So to be compliant then, we have to conduct what's called a critical entity risk assessment, which is defined within this particular directive. Okay, so measures must be in place such as, security fencing, barriers, perimeter monitoring, access control, all of the physical stuff that we don't really talk about in NIS2, but we do talk about in the CER. We have to have crisis management procedures in place, and that sounds very like what we have to have for NIS2 as well, insofar as we have to have a CCERT, but we're going to have similar crisis management procedures in here for these kind of physical, these kind of critical entity events. So alert routines, recovery plans. We have to be able to identify our critical suppliers, and we have to include requirements in them, in any procurement or contractual basis we have with them to supply things. If it's going to affect or potentially affect our critical entity risk assessment, then we have to put that in there as well. We have to make sure that our own personnel are vetted, particularly when they're in sensitive or critical roles. Reporting, again, 24 hours, we must give an initial notification. A detailed report must be supplied within 1 month, which mirrors what's in NIS2 as well. And again, governance and board accountability comes in here as well. We must demonstrate management board oversight, ownership and visibility has to be demonstrated within this. So again, very similar to NIS2. So you can see the kind of common commonality across the two. One difference with NIS2, the penalties are specified within NIS2. In the CER, member states get to establish their own rules on penalties, which is interesting because with NIS1, that was the state. Member states were able to establish their own rules. And one of the reasons for NIS2 was they felt that member states were cherry picking insofar as for their own organisations. So it allowed an organisation in Ireland to be penalised less, let's say, if our government felt like penalising them a little less than an organisation in France, despite the fact they were both providing in the same market. So it's surprising that they've left this one to member states, and probably will get changed, I'm sure, in some future version, CER2 or whatever. So all penalties then must be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. Again, that's the large numbers make it dissuasive. The enforcement powers then, there's officers are granted powers to enforce this. And in Ireland, that's under the statutory instrument that I talked about already. And they have the laws about, or the rules about how they can prosecute those offences. Okay, so that could be fines, or in very severe cases, even criminal sanctions. So they could even be jail for complete negligence. Compliance notice can also be issued to organisations if breaches are identified, and inspections and audits can be conducted as well. So the Cyber Resilience Act is all about products. So it's all fine having operators putting all these rules in about protecting their networks and putting in firewalls and putting in segmentation and all that good stuff. But what about the actual products that comes in? And I suppose a lot of this got triggered with the US and the UK in particular having a thing about Huawei and the products coming in and whether they had, spyware built into the products and all of that. So it decided that to address that we also had to make sure that products were coming in that, that they weren't compromised, that they weren't easy to hack, bearing in mind that somebody that hacks an IoT device might get access to a network, or someone that, a set-top box. So it may be a low-level box, and therefore you're selling it for 40 euros, and therefore when you're manufacturing it, do you take enough care of the cybersecurity of that device, considering that device might end up in 600, 700, 7,000, businesses around Europe or around Ireland for that matter. And therefore we now could have a situation where with a particular fancily named virus or, compromise, that they're now suddenly able to access universities and businesses and all sorts of organizations. So it said we have to specify the minimum level of security. So this legislation imposes mandatory security requirements. So it's saying that products being sold in the European Union must meet these particular standards. So the objectives then is to reduce vulnerabilities through the product life cycle, as you can see there, ensure security by design and security by default principles. These two principles actually come from the ISA 62443 set of standards originally, but they've now kind of, if you like, segued into other frameworks. And it's really the best thing to do to be secure by design and secure by default. And empower users then with transparent security information, because if I'm a small business owner and I want to buy a set-top box, is there a sticker on the back of the box that I can look at and say, oh yes, it's CE marked, therefore it meets the standard? So the implementation timeline of this, it originally came into force in 2024, and there was a 2-year kind of moratorium, if you like, to allow the industry to come into compliance. And the first part of it came in on the 11th of September of this year. It's to come in, and that's the reporting stage. So any failures have to be reported from that point. And then from Christmas 2027, there'll be full enforcement. So effectively, manufacturers were given a 3-year grace period to get their products into compliance, but only 21 months in terms of reporting, so we can start to see what's going on and then make sure that it's all closed out by 2027. So products coming into the European Union from that point on must be CE marked, and depending on the level of the product, it will determine, what level of testing has to happen on that product and who does that testing. So it applies to any software or hardware product with a direct or indirect data connection to a device or a network. So that could be smart home devices, Alexa, wearables, routers, OS, operating systems, business-to-business software. There are a couple of exclusions. Now, the exclusions are because there's a higher level standard somewhere else that's trapping that. So, for example, in terms of medical devices, there's a much higher level standard already expected of medical devices. There was no point in putting it in here because you're only duplicating. The same with motor. There's a very high set of standards in terms of motor and aviation. So they're regulated enough. They don't need this extra regulation. Okay, software as a service is covered. And it's also covered by NIS2 because obviously it's delivering services for operators. Open source, non-commercial software is excluded as well. So, Linux or, software that's in open source isn't necessarily caught under this particular standard because it doesn't come from a company. It's coming from an open source project. So what we then have is the CRA, its risk-based approach. It breaks things down under these 4 different headings. So the first one is unclassified. So starting out, speakers, photo editing software that's not really critical comes under a self-assessment class. So it does have to be compliant, but the organization who is making that software will certify it and say, yes, it meets the standard. Now, you could ask, well, is that really valid? But bearing in mind that it is legally required for organizations to report any breaches of that. So in other words, if some smart speaker was used as a way to attack a network, it will be found out fairly quickly. And then the company would have to show how it decided that self-assessment is okay. The next level then are important class 1. So you can see there, we have operating systems, we have authentication systems, smart home, password managers, network management systems. So now we're talking about stuff that, if you got access to, you could do a set of, damage. If they were compromised, you could use viruses or Trojans or whatever, and you could actually use them to cause problems. So there's a harmonized set of standards across these, and those standards must be complied with by the organization. So the organization doesn't set the standard. They simply have to comply with the harmonized standard that's been set for these products. And then important class 2. These are more important or considered more important. So we're talking hypervisors, containers, firewalls, intrusion detection, tamper-resistant microprocessors, etc. They must be assessed by a third party. So there's a conformity assessment board that they're appointed by the various member states, and you have to submit your products to them for assessment to show that they meet the requirements. Okay, and then we have critical products. Now, you might have come across a thing called the Common Criteria. It originated with the US military about two decades ago, and then there's an international standard common criteria for testing software and testing various hardware solutions as well. Well, the European Union, through this particular CRA, have a European Union common criteria standard set, and products have to meet that standard and have to be tested, showing that they meet that standard before they can be sold within the Union. So manufacturers must demonstrate minimal attack surface and encryption by default as they're secure by design. Okay, vulnerability management. They have to have a software bill of materials. Okay, so we can see exactly not just the hardware, but the software as well, elements within it. They must supply free security updates for a support period, which is typically set to 5 years. So they can't charge for that. They can't say you don't get your security updates unless you're paying a maintenance fee or something like that, which is common enough. They won't be able to do that anymore. They will have to supply free security updates. Okay, there must be clear documentation on how to decommission products and where to find those patches that were mentioned in the bullet above. And reporting, they must notify ANESA of any actively exploited vulnerability within 24 hours. So that's a requirement. Again, the penalties are quite high. So you can see the penalties there are for a security breach, 15 million, even higher than this 2.5% of annual turnover, whichever is the largest. Just reporting failures, very significant fines. So they're taking that quite seriously. And making any deceptive information into a competent body is a fairly serious fine as well. So these sanctions are actually quite large. And on top of the financial penalties, they can put market sanctions. So they can force an organization to recall products, or they can even ban sales across the European Union of a particular product. So it's some quite serious penalties there. So if you have products that you're selling, so you're bringing in products from outside the Union and you're trying to sell them within the European Union, look at your portfolio of products, determine whether the products fall into the classes important 1 or 2 or critical. And if they are, then make sure that the various rules against those are actually put in place. You need to look at any contracts you have with any third parties that supply components to you, whether they be physical or software, and make sure that they're CRA compliant. So organizations have to consider this over the next 12 months or so. Okay, the AI Act. So the AI Act, the AI has really hit us big time the last 2 years or so. And, everyone is going from, it's only another technology of evolution, and it's not going to affect jobs, to in 20 years' time, no one will have jobs. So there's all sorts of thoughts on AI. And the European Union is also worried about things like, well, is our citizens' data being abused as part of training data for AI? Is information about our citizens getting from one AI into another AI, or is it, how is it being used? Is products or intellectual property or any kind of rights that, people have artwork or text works or whatever, are they being used for training, and then are they being abused as part of responses coming from AI to various queries, or even actions? For example, AI being used in the war in Eastern Europe at the moment, or in the Middle East, where it's being used for targeting information. So what the European Union decided to do is to lay down this regulation, 2024-1689, laying down harmonized rules on artificial intelligence. And the functions of that was to protect fundamental rights of European citizens and the safety of European citizens. They wanted to promote investment and innovation in what, let's say, they're calling genuine AI within Europe. So AI that meets these regulations. And they wanted to make sure that there was an established single market across the Union for lawful AI applications. So it's basically regulating AI based on its potential to do harm to citizens and not the technology itself. So it doesn't really regulate the technology. It's saying the technology itself must meet these rules. Okay, so just on the timelines for this particular standard. So the first one is it's coming to force in 2024, and phase 1 prohibitions came into force in 2025 in February. And that's basically a ban on unacceptable risky AI. So social scoring, manipulative AI. There's AI literacy requirements for staff to take effect. All of those prohibitions are there now. So, for example, if you remember the Cambridge Analytica using data that actually was unacceptable, that's banned now. That kind of thing should not happen. Okay. Phase 2, which came in last August, is basically looking at general purpose AI models. So there's a European AI office which was formed, and that European AI office, and member states have to create their own AI office, which we have to do by August this year actually, and they have to have a penalty system in place to actually look at what happens if these Gen AIs break the rules. Okay, and we saw that with the Grok one, where it was doing the pornographic pictures or whatever, undressing women and whatever, and that kind of thing is obviously not on. Phase 3, which is due in August of this year, implements what's called Part A, Annex 3. Okay, and that's basically rules again on high-risk AI. So that's looking at things like recruitment. So staffing, taking CVs and basically processing CVs, that kind of thing. Looking at education, law enforcement. And there are transparency obligations as part of that particular phase as well. For example, chatbots or deep fakes, they must be labeled. So if you're talking to a chatbot that you know that it's a chatbot, not a human, and in other words, it has to be labeled, it has to tell you I'm Ernie the chatbot or whatever, so that you know you're not dealing with a human. Phase 4, which is coming in August 2027, is for high risk part B, which is basically Annex 1. And Annex 1 are things like toys, medical devices, vehicles. So any models that are on the market before 2025 must also be in compliance by that stage as well. So if something was invented or developed before 2025, and therefore it's okay up as far as 2027, but from 2027 it must be in compliance also to be allowed to be continued. And then the final stage is 2030. Okay, that's your public sector legacy. So sort of for large-scale legacy IT systems used by public authorities must be brought into full compliance as well. So that's kind of the timeline. So there's a lot of graded implementation, if you like, of the AI Act over the next sort of 5 years. So AI systems then are graded then in the Act into 4 different levels based on the potential harm they pose rather than what technology they use. So what's considered unacceptable then and strictly prohibited is threat to people, safety, or their people's rights. So you can see social scoring, manipulative behavior, real-time biometrics, etc. are unacceptable. You just can't do them. They're not allowed, and that's it. High risk then. These are permitted but subject to compliance and testing. So infrastructure, education, recruitment, law enforcement, those areas. Limited risk. So there are transparency obligations here insofar as you can use AI for chatbots, etc. But people need to be aware they're not dealing with humans. They need to be aware that they're chatbots. And minimal risk then. So that's where you're using AI for spam filters, video games, etc. That's okay. Okay, so general purpose AI then. So we have one of the areas that has to be transparent in terms of them. So if we're taking models like GPT-4, like Claude, etc., they must follow transparency rules. They must disclose where their training sets come from. Okay, so that must be disclosed, and they must comply also with EU copyright law, and that they can't be using stuff that's copyrighted as part of those training sets. So even if they declare it, they must, they can't use it effectively as copyrighted. Governance then is overseen by the European AI Office, which exists. And Ireland is creating a new office. I would have thought this would have gone to the National Cybersecurity Centre, but it didn't. They've created are creating a new office called the National AI Office, which should come into place before the 2nd of August 2026, so this year. And that will oversee and do penalties and implement penalties for AI organizations that, whether they be small edge AI or whether they're, big models like the ChatGPT and Claude, etc. Penalties, again, are very, very high, from 7 million or 1.5% of global turnover to 35 million or 7%, depending on the severity. So you can imagine 70% of global turnover for an organization like Google or Microsoft or whatever would be very, very large. So they have to be very, very careful that they're in compliance. And it's one of the reasons that you see American politicians railing against the idea that Europe has these regulations, and that these regulations they're saying are anti-competitive and all that kind of thing, because they don't like them, because they're generally US companies that are coming out with these products. So last few slides here, the Cybersecurity Act 2. This is kind of an updated version of an act that was there already, but the idea here is to address threats to supply chains. Okay, and it expands in essence mandate the resources. It gives them more resources and operational cooperation role as well among the member states. So the idea is to create a harmonized EU framework to de-risk ICT supply chain from high-risk third country suppliers. So we have supplies and equipment coming in from outside. How do you do that? So what it's done is it created this European cyber certification framework, and that makes it more agile and more network market responsive. So the market, it's more responsive to the market, and kind of it's looking at the supply chain right across all of these other frameworks that I just talked about already. Not framework, sorry, directives. directives and acts, etc. And it brings into place this digital omnibus. So the idea here is that incident reporting for all of the others I've talked about comes through this digital omnibus. So we don't get this reporting fatigue where companies are reporting to one organization for this and another organization for that, and they're in different formats, etc. There's one format, one way to do it. So the Commission are identifying specific assets that are essential for the operation of NIS2 critical sectors. So taking those sectors, they're the ones that this 5-step mechanism within the CSF2 has to consider. So a coordinated European Union evaluation of threats in the risk assessment. A risk verification then is an investigation of non-technical risks. For example, third country law interference, lack of judicial remedies, etc. They'll look into those. High-risk supplier designation. So there's formal identification of suppliers. Mitigation measures then, the imposition of restrictions, for example, supplier transparency, data transfer limits, technical audits, etc. And then prohibitions, potential EU-wide ban on components for high-risk suppliers, etc. in key critical areas. So that's, the overall side of it. And if we look then at the framework itself, it's looking at beyond just ICT products to include your full cyber posture certification. So assessing the organization's overall cybersecurity maturity, not just the ICT products. It is implemented on ENESA, a 12-month binding guideline. Sorry, not guideline, a binding requirement. So when they're bringing in new technical security standards, they're basically instructed by the Commission, a new standard is needed for X or Y. Then it's got 1 year to bring that standard to place. Because what the European Union does not want is bottlenecks with, the organization taking way too much time to bring these standards to fruition. It wants those standards in quick time. So it's saying 1 year maximum. And a regular review then of these at maximum 4 years to ensure that all these schemes are staying current. Okay, and synergy across all of the different standards through the digital omnibus so that you can get a certification through this to say, I am conforming to NIS2, I am conforming to the AI Act, I am conforming, etc. So the whole idea is to bring them all together as if one big bastion of tools, if you like, for cybersecurity, from physical right up to software, hardware, and services. So this is just a quick summary then. So we have our, NIS2, we talked about that, implementing risk management and reporting incidents. We have our physical resilience then through the critical entities resilience. Okay, so that's mapping dependencies and resilience planning. We have product security. Okay, so that's looking at CE marking and then right up to EU, the EU CC common criteria. We have the AI Act, looking at AI and making sure that AI is behaving itself and that the models are safe for human use and that there has to be oversight on that. And then the Cybersecurity Act 2, which is pulling all that together to give us our digital omnibus and to make sure that there's a harmonized sort of certification that someone can use to demonstrate presumption of conformity depending on what products they're actually working on. Sorry, I ran a little bit over on time there. So thank you very much, and I'm open to questions on any of that.
Well, thank you very much, Dermot. It's very comprehensive coverage of all the upcoming regulations that certainly have to be in place for organisations within Ireland. As we are running about 15 minutes over, we will limit it to say 3 or 4 questions, which I will now read out. Okay, so one here from Gary. Once drafted into law, what does the timescale look like for the competent authorities to begin engaging with enterprises?
Immediately. So they're actually already in place. So I know, for example, the Maritime, they have their centre in place. Comreg have been in place for ages. In fact, we put the cart before the horse here. So we've actually put everything in place, but we haven't the law to allow it to happen. So whereas other countries did the opposite, they put the law in place and then they had a run-in time while they developed all the Belgians have this in place for, a year and a half. So they've gone the other way around where they put the law in place and then put in the infrastructure. We seem to have gone the other way around. We've put the infrastructure in and they've just dilly-dallied. We had an election which slowed things down, and then we've had a few bits and bobs that have just slowed things down, and other priorities came in the way, and it's just got slow and slow and slow. But once it comes into play, all the other stuff's already in place.
And I have a question here from Ed asking about the fragmentation. It seems that it's all divided up into different sections. Would it have been not easier if I had one authority cover all of the aspects?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ed, and that was the case with NIST 1, with version 1. However, I think in lots of ways, if you think about the challenge that was, probably a year ago, if you remember all that thing about the hoo-ha, about the director of the National Cybersecurity Centre not being paid enough and there wasn't enough resources and all of that. So when the National Cybersecurity Centre looked at what resources they were being given and what they had, they're looking and going, well, we can't do all of this. It's not like in the past where we only dealt with the telecom providers. We're now dealing with all of those other sectors as well, and we just don't have the resources. We'd have to have an army to do it. So what they decided to do then is, actually, you know what? The maritime is the responsibility of the Department of the Marine, or the Department of Transport, and the banking is the responsibility of the bank regulator, and the Comreg does the telecoms, etc. So why can't they take each of their own domains, and we'll act as an oversight body, if you like? So, I suppose it's just a decision, Ed, that they made because they didn't have the resources to be able to do this, and it was very unlikely they were going to get the army that they'd need to do it. So they pushed the responsibility out to the various regulators and, utility commissions, etc., to do it.
And here a question from James here asking about does this open up potential opportunities for consultants, enterprise as a new role to help all these organizations to be compliant?
Absolutely, absolutely it does. First of all, there these conformity assessment boards. They don't exist, so organizations are going to have to put themselves forward to be a bit like Lloyd's, for example, would have done ISO 9000. I remember when I worked in American companies, you'd have Lloyd's come in every 3 years or whatever to look at your ISO 9000 certification. In a similar way, we're going to have conformity assessment boards that are going to come in and audit and then provide verification certificates or certification certificates in case of essential entities. You're going to, it probably will be similar bodies that would currently assess ISO 27000 or ISA 62443, but that's definitely a role. But you're also going to have consultancy roles where people are going to need, come in and explain what the process is, work through the whole process of implementing, much as you do today with organizations doing 27001 or doing the 62443. But it's just going to be expanded because you've now, your small wireless provider in West Cork is going to now require to put stuff in place because they've become an important entity under NIST 2. So they're going to have to put stuff in place. Now, thankfully, the NCSC put SciFun in place, but SciFun itself requires a fair bit of knowledge to implement SciFun across an organization and get them, to demonstrate compliance of the risk management methods.
Okay, and we have a question in here from Charles. What are the specific issues when dealing with cross-border, like, for example, the Irish Rail operating their enterprise service that goes through Northern Ireland? How are we going to deal with non-EU countries?
Yeah, well, that's going to have to be done on a bilateral basis because the Northern Ireland are not in the European Union, and NIST 2 really applies to the European Union. Having said that, the UK are kind of implementing their own variant of NIST 2, but one of their problems is that I suppose they sold Brexit on the idea that they were going to be able to do everything independently and then realized that, well, actually, we can't operate in a market with the rest of Europe unless we're compliant because they'll just say you can't sell because you don't meet any of these regulations. So they've had to really build regulations that run in parallel to a lot of these. So it's not as hard a problem as you would imagine because they've already gone and done that for within the United Kingdom, for example. But in terms of Ireland, will have to create bilateral agreements with Northern Ireland based on that to actually make sure we have compliance across the border for something like, as you said, the enterprise service. And there's lots of other services, even the mobile provision, sure, if you're up in Monaghan, you could be connected to a cell tower in Northern Ireland, and there's lots of services crisscrossing the border like that.
Yeah. And a follow-up question here about air gapping. Does air gapping really work, and how can it exist in modern factories?
It worked about 1995. It doesn't really work anymore because you provide software, Jeffrey, there that manages ports, right? So you have a piece of software there that's managing a port. You don't have that sitting in the manufacturing zone for the port. I know manufacturing zone is, you think in terms of manufacturing, but in terms of utilities, let's call it the utility zone then, right? So you have containers going on with robots onto ships, and the containers are being brought on, and unaccompanied containers, and you have accompanied containers and all that going in and off ships, and the software has to manage all of that movement and has to know that such a container and where it is and what square of the ship is being used and all that sort of stuff. And you don't have that software sitting in your utility zone. That's sitting in your enterprise zone. So in lots of ways, that air gap is a figment of the past, if you like. So it's been replaced by that demilitarized zone. But that demilitarized zone then becomes very important. So there's one way that it can be managed that kind of simulates an air gap, is to create what's called a data diode. That means that data traffic can only pass from your manufacturing or your utility zone, say northbound, towards your enterprise zone. So in that case, you're probably only using it for reporting. So you'd have unsolicited reporting from some sort of software agents that will be sitting in the manufacturing zone that's reporting values back up to software that's sitting in the enterprise zone. That's relatively safe because a data diode is a physical thing. It's an optical thing in that data cannot travel north-south. It can only travel south-north, right? However, you could use firewalls as well, but again, firewall rules will have to be very, very careful, and firewalls can be vulnerable to cyber attack as well. So it's very important that it's locked down as much as absolutely possible, and that any instructions that are passing from north-south, in other words, from the enterprise zone into the manufacturing zone, that they're really curtailed and controlled.
And just one final question is, what resources or training would you recommend people who want to pursue this area further?
Yeah, well, I suppose I have to sell our own stuff here anyway. First, we have a master's in cybersecurity for industrial cybersecurity and critical infrastructure. We also have a certificate that we run on this stuff at night as well. It's a sort of a 2-hour level 9 program, but there are a number of programs. In fact, there's not a lot in terms of the OT. There's lots in terms of the IT side. There's lots of cyber. Every college has cybersecurity programs, and there's non-college variants of cybersecurity programs. Not too much in the OT world. I know UL also have a professional certificate in the operational side as well, operational technology. But yeah, it's an area that I suppose with NIS2 coming in, there's going to be a lot of actually opportunity there, even for providing training in terms of because the Cybersecurity Act has got delayed by so much. People had money put aside for training and preparing and all of that. And then as Cybersecurity Act never came into play, then, that money got reused for something else, and it kind of got put back in the back burner, and maybe recruitment didn't happen in the way it should have happened. But as that comes into play, we'll probably find that there'll be a rush to try to get training in place and try to have consultancies and stuff like that going on once they realize actually it's in law. So hope that answers your question.
It sure does. And yeah, I'd like to thank you again for a great presentation, and for everyone who stuck around for our Q&A. The talk will be available on YouTube at a later date.